Jake Murphy sat in the back corner of the classroom, trying to make himself as small as possible. The chair was too small for his human frame, but he had learned not to complain. Complaining drew attention, and attention was the last thing he wanted at the Galactic Diplomatic Academy. The academy floated in space on Station Kepler 7, a massive structure that housed students from 43 different species. It was supposed to be the most peaceful place in the galaxy, where even natural enemies could learn to work together. Jake had been here for 6 months now, and he still felt like an outsider. Professor Veltar stood at the front of the advanced xenobiology classroom. The old Zenthari looked like he was made of living crystal, his skin reflecting the soft lights of the room. His voice was gentle and musical when he spoke. Today we will discuss predator and prey relationships across different worlds, he announced. Jake looked around the classroom. Most of the other students were what humans would call cute. The Cathani looked like giant rabbits with soft fur and big eyes. The spiral folk were long and thin like friendly snakes with arms. There were others too. The Veltani with their flower-like faces, and the small Piptar who always spoke in whispers. All of them were peaceful species. Their worlds were safe places with gentle weather and plenty of food. They had never known real hunger or fear. They had never had to fight for survival. Jake was different. Earth was listed as a Class 7 deathworld in the galactic database. Only a few species in the entire galaxy came from worlds that dangerous. Most people knew humans were from a deathworld, but they did not really understand what that meant. The relationship between predator and prey is found on most worlds, Professor Veltar continued. However, advanced civilizations have moved beyond such primitive behaviors. We use farming and technology to provide food. We no longer hunt each other. A Cathani student named Soft Paws raised her furry hand. Professor, why do some species still have predatory instincts if civilization has made them unnecessary? An excellent question, the professor replied. Evolution takes millions of years to change. Even peaceful species may carry old instincts in their genes. However, education and culture help us overcome these primitive urges. Jake shifted in his seat. He knew about primitive urges. Every day he had to control instincts that his classmates could not imagine. When someone moved too quickly behind him, his body wanted to spin around and defend itself. When he saw someone in distress, he wanted to help, even if it meant fighting. When food was scarce in the cafeteria, part of him wanted to take what he needed. But Jake had learned to hide these feelings. In his first week at the academy, he had helped carry some heavy equipment. The other students had watched in shock as he lifted things that should have taken 3 of them to move. Word spread quickly that the human was unnaturally strong. After that, many students avoided him, so Jake learned to be careful. He walked slowly and quietly. He spoke softly. He never showed his full strength or speed. He tried to blend in, to seem as harmless as his classmates. Now, Professor Veltar said, let us examine the predator species of Valdor Prime. The Valdorians are one of the few advanced species that still maintain strong predatory characteristics. The professor touched his control pad, and a hologram appeared in the center of the room. It showed a creature that made several students gasp. The Valdorian was 8 feet tall with black scales that looked like armor. Its hands ended in sharp claws, and its yellow eyes seemed to stare right through the hologram at the watching students. The Valdorians come from a Class 4 world, the professor explained. Their planet is more dangerous than most, but not as extreme as the true deathworlds. They evolved as apex predators, hunting in small packs, Even today, their culture values strength and dominance above most other traits. Pip, a small Kethani student, raised her hand nervously. Professor, are there any Valdorians at the Academy? Not currently, Professor Veltar replied. The Valdorian government has been reluctant to participate in our exchange programs. They prefer to keep their young people on their home world for traditional training. Jake had read about Valdorians in the Academy database. They were known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors and skilled hunters. Most species feared them, though they had been peaceful members of the galactic community for over 100 years. Their ships were some of the best in the galaxy, and their soldiers were legendary. But Jake also knew something that his classmates did not. Valdorians came from a Class 4 world. Earth was Class 7. The classification system went from 1 to 10, with 10 being worlds so dangerous that life could barely survive. Jake had never met a Valdorian, but according to the numbers, his world was much more dangerous than theirs. Are there any questions about predator-prey relationships? Professor Veltar asked. Crystal Song, a young Xanthari student, raised her hand. Her crystalline skin sparkled with nervous energy. Professor, how do predator species control their instincts around prey species? Does education really make them safe? The professor's skin dimmed slightly, which Jake had learned meant the Xanthari was thinking carefully. Education and civilization are powerful forces, he said finally. Most predator species learn to suppress their hunting instincts through training and social pressure. However, it requires constant effort and self-control. Jake knew exactly what the professor meant. Right now, he could hear the heartbeats of half the students in the room. His human ears could pick up sounds that most species could not detect. He could smell fear, excitement, and dozens of other emotions through the room's air system. These were hunting adaptations that his ancestors had used to track prey across the African savanna. But he kept this knowledge to himself. He had learned that sharing such things only frightened his classmates. The class continued for another hour, covering the ecosystems of various worlds and how different species had evolved to fill different roles. Jake took careful notes, though he already knew most of the material from his own studies. When the class ended, Jake waited for the other students to leave before standing up. He had learned that his full height, over 6 feet, could intimidate the smaller species. He gathered his materials slowly and walked toward the door. As he left the classroom, Jake did not know that his quiet, peaceful life at the academy was about to change forever. The next morning, Jake was settling into his usual seat in advanced xenobiology when the classroom door burst open with a loud bang. The sound made every student in the room jump, and several of the smaller species let out frightened squeaks. A massive figure filled the doorway. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat as he recognized the creature from yesterday's lesson. A Valdorian stood in the entrance, scanning the room with predatory yellow eyes. The alien was even more impressive in person than in the hologram. 8 feet of pure muscle covered in obsidian-black scales that seemed to absorb the light. The Valdorian's presence changed everything in the room. Jake could smell the fear that suddenly filled the air. It was a sharp, bitter scent that his human nose picked up immediately. Around him, students pressed back in their seats, trying to make themselves smaller. "Ah," Professor Veltar said, his crystalline skin flickering with nervous energy. "Class, please welcome our new student. This is Zexthar of the Valdorian Star Clans." Zexthar stepped into the room without invitation. His claws clicked against the metal floor with each step. He moved like a hunter, every motion smooth and calculated. His head turned slowly as he examined each student, and Jake saw several classmates flinch when those yellow eyes passed over them. "I am here for the integration program," Zexthar announced. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel grinding. "Together. My government has decided that some of us should learn your peaceful ways." The way he said peaceful made it sound like an insult. Soft Paws, the Cathani student, quietly gathered her things and slipped toward the door. Two other students followed her. Jake did not blame them. Every instinct they had was probably screaming at them to run from this predator. Professor Veltar tried to maintain control of the situation. "Zexathar, please choose any available seat. We were just beginning today's lesson on ecosystem balance." The Valdorian's gaze swept across the empty seats. There were several options in the back corners, away from the other students. Instead, Zexthar deliberately walked to the center of the room and sat down in a chair that was clearly too small for his massive frame. The metal creaked under his weight. From his new position, Zexthar could see every other student in the room. More. Importantly, they all had to look at him. Jake realized this was no accident. The Valdorian was establishing dominance, making sure everyone knew he was the apex predator in this space. Jake studied Zexathar carefully. The alien's body language told a clear story. His shoulders were squared, his claws rested casually on the desk where everyone could see them, and his head was held high. Everything about his posture said, "I am the danger here." But there was something else in Zexthar's movements that caught Jake's attention. The Valdorian was not just confident. He was performing. His dominance display was too obvious, too theatrical. Jake had seen similar behavior in high school bullies who were actually insecure underneath their tough exterior. "Now then," Professor Veltar continued, trying to restore normalcy to the class. "Today we will discuss how ecosystem balance is maintained through natural selection and environmental pressures." Zexthar leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously. "On Valdor Prime, we maintain balance through strength," he interrupted. "The weak serve the strong, or they are removed from the ecosystem entirely." Several students made small, frightened sounds. Crystal Song's skin began to flash with stress patterns, rapid pulses of light that indicated high anxiety in Zenthari physiology. "That is one perspective," Professor Veltar said diplomatically. "However, most advanced civilizations have found that cooperation produces better results than competition." Zexthar's laugh was not pleasant. It sounded like rocks falling down a cliff. "Cooperation is what prey animals do when they are too weak to survive alone. True predators take what they need." Jake felt his hands clench into fists under his desk. He forced himself to relax them. Getting angry would not help the situation, and it would certainly not help his classmates, who were clearly terrified. As the lesson continued, Zexthar made several more comments designed to intimidate the other students. He described Valdorian hunting techniques in graphic detail. He talked about the natural order, where strong species dominated weak ones. He made it clear that he considered everyone else in the room to be prey. The other students became more and more uncomfortable. Pip, the small Kethani, was shaking so hard that her fur stood on end. Two more students quietly excused themselves and left the classroom. Jake watched it all with growing concern. He had dealt with bullies before back on Earth. But those bullies had been human teenagers with human limitations. Zexthar was a fully grown alien predator who could probably kill half the class without breathing hard. What worried Jake most was that Zexthar seemed to be enjoying the fear he was causing. The Valdorian's eyes grew brighter each time a student flinched or moved away from him. This was not just natural predatory behavior. This was someone who took pleasure in frightening others. Near the end of class, Zexthar's attention settled on Jake himself. The Valdorian stared at him for several long seconds, those yellow eyes studying him carefully. "You are the human," Zexthar said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jake replied quietly. "I have heard of your species. Deathworlders, like my own people." Zexthar's scaled lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it showed far too many sharp teeth. "Perhaps you will be more interesting than these soft prey animals." Jake met the Valdorian's gaze steadily, but did not respond. He had learned that sometimes the best response to a bully was no response at all. When class ended, Jake waited again for the other students to leave first. He noticed that they moved faster than usual, practically fleeing from the room. Several cast nervous glances back at Zexthar, who remained seated and watched them go. As Jake finally stood to leave, he felt those yellow eyes tracking his movement. He could sense that Zexthar was evaluating him, trying to determine if he was a threat or just another potential victim. Jake walked calmly toward the door, showing no fear or aggression, but inside, his human instincts were starting to wake up. Something ancient and protective was stirring in the back of his mind, the part of him that came from millions of years of evolution on a world where only the strong and smart survived. He had a feeling he was going to need those instincts very soon. Over the next 3 days, Zexthar made his presence felt throughout the academy. Jake watched with growing anger as the Valdorian systematically terrorized the other students. It started small. In the hallways between classes, Zexthar would, accidentally, bump into smaller students. His massive frame would send them sprawling while he offered fake apologies that fooled no one. When a Spiral Folk student named Coilbright dropped his datapad after one such collision, Zexthar stepped on it while pretending not to notice. In the cafeteria, Zexthar established himself as the dominant predator. He would take food from other students' trays without asking, claiming he needed proper nutrition for a growing Valdorian. When a group of Veltani students complained to the staff, Zexthar simply smiled and said he was sharing in the spirit of cooperation. The academy administration was helpless. Zexthar never did anything that technically violated the rules. He was careful to make his aggression look accidental or cultural. When confronted, he would claim he was simply acting according to Valdorian customs, and the staff had to respect cultural differences. Jake saw through the act immediately. This was not cultural behavior. This was deliberate bullying. Zexthar was smart enough to stay just within the boundaries of what he could get away with. The worst part was watching how the other students reacted. They were not used to predators or violence. Their species had evolved on safe worlds where cooperation was the norm. They had no defenses against someone like Zexthar. Soft Paws stopped coming to classes entirely. Crystal Song's skin flickered with constant stress patterns. Even the usually cheerful Piptar spoke only in whispers and jumped at every sudden sound. Jake wanted to help, but he held back. He had worked too hard to build trust with his classmates. If he confronted Zexthar directly, it would confirm every stereotype about violent deathworlders. The other students might fear him as much as they feared the Valdorian. On the 4th day, Jake's restraint was put to the ultimate test. He was walking to his next class when he heard familiar voices around the corner. One belonged to Lisa Carter. the only other human at the academy. Lisa was 2 years younger than Jake and had arrived just a month ago. She was one of the few students who treated him normally, without fear or suspicion. The other voice belonged to Zexathar. Jake quietly moved closer and peered around the corner. Lisa was pressed against the wall of a side corridor, her books clutched tightly to her chest. Zexathar loomed over her, using his massive size to trap her in place. "So you are the other human," Zexathar was saying. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something predatory in his tone that made Jake's skin crawl. "Much smaller than your male counterpart. More delicate. Please let me pass," Lisa said. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. "I need to get to class." Zexathar leaned closer, and Jake saw Lisa press herself further against the wall. "There is no hurry. I am curious about your species. You claim to be from a death world, but you seem so soft, so vulnerable." One of Zexathar's claws traced the air near Lisa's face, not quite touching, but close enough to be threatening. "I wonder what it would be like to hunt something like you on your homeworld. Would you run? Would you hide? Or would you simply give up?" Jake's vision went red. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to charge around that corner and tear Zexathar apart. His muscles tensed, ready to spring into action, but he forced himself to stop. If he attacked Zexathar now, it would prove that humans were violent and dangerous. It would undo months of careful relationship building. Worse, it might put Lisa in more danger. Instead, Jake stepped around the corner casually, as if he had just arrived. "Hey, Lisa," he called out in a normal voice. "Ready for Professor Keth's exam tomorrow?" The interruption broke the spell. Zexathar stepped back, his predatory focus shifting to Jake. Lisa took the opportunity to slip away from the wall. "Oh, Jake," she said, relief clear in her voice. "Yes, I was just heading to the library to study." "Good idea," Jake replied. He kept his voice calm and friendly, but he positioned himself between Lisa and Zexathar. "I'll walk with you." Zexathar studied them both for a moment. Jake met his gaze steadily, neither backing down nor showing aggression. After a few seconds, the Valdorian's lips curved into that unpleasant smile. "How touching," Zexathar said. The male protecting the female. Very primitive. Very instinctual. He turned and walked away, his claws clicking on the metal floor. Jake waited until the sound faded before turning to Lisa. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Lisa nodded, but Jake could see she was shaken. "He's been following me around for 2 days," she whispered. "I think he's testing me, seeing how I react." "Stay near other people," Jake advised. "Don't go anywhere alone, and if he corners you again, make noise. Lots of noise." "What about you?" Lisa asked. "He's obviously interested in humans. Won't he come after you next?" Jake shrugged. Let him try. But as they walked to the library together, Jake's mind was racing. Zexathar was escalating his behavior. Intimidating students in public was one thing, but cornering Lisa in a deserted corridor was something else entirely. The Valdorian was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before someone pushed back. Jake knew he could not let this continue, but he also knew that any action he took had to be careful and calculated. One wrong move could make the situation worse for everyone. That night, Jake lay in his small dormitory room and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his home on Earth, where bullies were dealt with quickly and directly. He thought about his training in martial arts and military tactics, skills that he had never mentioned to anyone at the academy. Most of all, he thought about Lisa's frightened face and the way Zexthar had enjoyed her fear. Jake had spent months hiding what he truly was. He had pretended to be harmless, gentle, and civilized, but Zexthar was threatening people under his protection now. And that changed everything. Jake closed his eyes and let himself remember what it felt like to be a human from Earth, a persistence predator from a Class 7 Deathworld. Tomorrow, he decided, it might be time to remind Zexthar exactly what that meant. The Valdorian wanted to play dominance games with a Deathworlder. Jake was going to show him the difference between a Class 4 Predator and a Class 7 Survivor. The next day's advanced xenobiology class focused on planetary ecosystems and the role of apex predators. Professor Veltar had prepared an extensive lesson on how different worlds maintained natural balance, but Jake could tell the professor was nervous about having Zexthar in the room. Apex predators serve an important function in most ecosystems, Professor Veltar began, his crystalline skin showing muted colors that indicated stress. They control population levels of prey species and maintain the health of the overall bee system. Zexthar immediately interrupted. Finally, a topic worth discussing, he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. On Valdor Prime, we understand the importance of strong predators. It is what has made our species great. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jake noticed that attendance was down again. Only 12 students remained in a class that had started with 25. The others had apparently decided that advanced xenobiology was not worth the risk of being in the same room as the Valdorian. Yes, well, Professor Veltar continued carefully. Predators do play a role. However, in advanced civilizations, we have moved beyond simple predator-prey relationships. Technology and cooperation allow us to maintain balance without violence. Zexthar laughed, and the sound made Pip visibly flinch. Professor, you speak like someone who has never faced real hunger or real danger. Cooperation is fine for gathering berries and sharing water, but when resources become scarce, when survival is at stake, only the strong deserve to live. Jake felt his jaw clench. He had heard similar arguments before, usually from people who had never actually faced real hardship. Zexthar was spouting survival of the strongest philosophy like it was some profound truth. Perhaps you could share your perspective on hunting. Strategies, Professor Veltar suggested, clearly hoping to channel Zexthar's energy into something educational. The Valdorian stood up, his massive frame dominating the center of the room. Gladly, he said, and Jake could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Valdorian hunting is an art form. We do not simply kill, we demonstrate superiority. Zexthar began to pace around the classroom as he spoke, his movements deliberate and predatory. First, we select our prey. Not the strongest or fastest. Those provide good sport but poor lessons. We choose the weak, the slow, the ones who think they can hide in groups for protection. Crystal Song's skin began to pulse with rapid stress. Patterns. Jake could see her trying to make herself smaller in her seat. Then comes the hunt itself, Zexthar continued, his yellow eyes scanning the terrified students. We do not rush. We follow. We let the prey know it is being hunted. We watch it grow tired, frightened, desperate. The fear makes the meat taste better. That's enough, Professor Veltar said firmly. This is supposed to be an academic discussion. not a description of violence. Zexathar turned to face the professor, and Jake saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. Violence? Professor, I am describing the natural order, the way things have always been and always will be. Some species are born to hunt. Others are born to be hunted. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on each student. The universe is not a peaceful place despite what you teach here. Beyond these safe walls, predators rule. Prey species survive only because predators allow it. Pip, the small Kethani student, raised a trembling hand. But sir, she said in a voice barely above a whisper, don't you think that intelligent species should move beyond such primitive behaviors? Surely we can evolve past the need for violence. Zexathar's attention focused on her like a laser. He began walking slowly toward her desk, and Jake saw Pip's ears flatten against her head in terror. Evolve past violence? Zexathar repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Little rabbit, you speak like someone who has never been truly hungry, who has never had to choose between your life and another's. He stopped directly in front of Pip's desk, towering over her. Natural selection does not stop just because we build cities and write laws. The weak still die. The strong still take what they need. The only difference is that now we pretend it is not happening. Jake could smell the fear pouring off Pip in waves. The small alien was paralyzed with terror, unable to even speak. On my homeworld, Zexathar continued, leaning down closer to Pip, your species would not last a single day. You would be food for creatures that actually deserve to live. Perhaps that is what should happen here as well. Natural selection taking its course. That was the moment Jake's restraint finally cracked. He had watched Zexathar intimidate his classmates for days. He had held back when Lisa was threatened. He had swallowed his anger when weaker students were bullied. But threatening Pip with death was a line too far. Jake stood up slowly from his seat in the back corner. The movement was deliberate and controlled, but something in his posture had changed. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he was not trying to hide what he was. Sit down, Zexathar, Jake said quietly. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something underneath the words that made every person in the room go completely still. Even Professor Veltar stopped moving. Zexathar straightened and turned to face Jake. The human speaks, he said with amusement. Have you finally decided to join the conversation? I said, sit down, Jake repeated. He had not raised his voice, but the words carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. For a moment, the two predators stared at each other across the classroom. Jake could see Zexathar evaluating him, trying to decide if the quiet human was actually a threat. Then, Zexathar smiled his unpleasant smile. Or what, Deathworlder? Will you show these soft prey animals your true nature? Will you prove that humans are just as violent as everyone fears? Jake took a single step forward. Try me. The words were spoken softly, but they carried the promise of violence that Jake had been holding back for months. In that moment, every student in the room understood that they were watching two apex predators face off, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, Zexathar looked uncertain. The confrontation in class ended without violence, but Jake could feel the tension building like a storm ready to break. Zexathar had backed down for the moment, returning to his seat with a casual shrug as if nothing had happened. But Jake saw the way the Valdorian's eyes tracked his movement for the rest of the class. 2 days later, the storm finally broke. Jake was walking back from the engineering lab when he heard voices echoing from one of the maintenance corridors. The academy was a massive structure with hundreds of service passages that students rarely used. These corridors were dimly lit and isolated, perfect places for someone to corner victims without witnesses. Jake recognized one of the voices immediately. Crystal Song, the young Zenthari student, was speaking in rapid, panicked tones. Her words were too fast and too high-pitched for Jake to understand, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. Another voice responded, deep, rough, and unmistakably belonging to Zexathar. Jake moved quickly but quietly toward the sound. His human hearing allowed him to track the conversation even through the metal walls of the corridor. As he got closer, he could make out more details. "Please, just let us pass," a different voice was saying. Jake recognized it as belonging to Spiral Bright, one of the Spiral Folk students. "We need to get back to our dormitories." "There is no hurry," Zexthar replied, his voice carrying that same predatory satisfaction Jake had heard when he cornered Lisa. "I am simply curious about your physiology. How fast can your species move when properly motivated?" Jake reached the entrance to the maintenance corridor and carefully peered around the corner. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 students were pressed against the far wall of the narrow passage. Crystal Song was in the center, her crystalline skin flickering with rapid stress patterns that hurt to look at. On either side of her were Spiral Bright and a small Piptar student named Whisper Soft. Zexthar stood between them and the exit, his massive frame completely blocking their escape route. He was not touching them, but he did not need to. His presence alone was enough to terrorize the 3 smaller aliens. "On my homeworld," Zexthar was saying conversationally, "we have creatures similar to your species. The crystal singers are particularly interesting. Their bodies shatter so beautifully when they experience extreme fear." Crystal Song made a sound like breaking glass. Her stress patterns were becoming more and more rapid, and Jake realized with horror that she was approaching some kind of physiological breaking point. "The spiral crawlers are good sport, too," Zexthar continued, turning his attention to Spiral Bright. "They can move very fast when chased, but they tire quickly. Usually we catch them within the first few miles." Spiral Bright was coiled tightly against the wall, his normally graceful form rigid with terror. "And the little squeakers," Zexthar said, looking down at Whisper Soft, "they make such interesting sounds when they are frightened. Would you like to demonstrate for me?" That was when Jake noticed Zexthar's breathing. The Valdorian was breathing deeply, deliberately, as if he was savoring something in the air. With a shock of disgust, Jake realized that Zexathar was literally feeding off their fear. He was enjoying their terror like a drug. "Please," Crystal Song gasped, her voice becoming more distorted as her stress levels spiked. "We have done nothing wrong. We just want to leave." "Nothing wrong?" Zexthar laughed. "You exist. On most worlds, that would be crime enough for prey species like you. You consume resources that could go to stronger, more deserving creatures." He leaned closer to Crystal Song, and Jake saw her skin begin to crack. Actual fissures were appearing in her crystalline surface as her body failed to cope with the overwhelming stress. "Perhaps," Zexthar whispered, "it is time for natural selection to take its course here at the Academy. Perhaps the weak should be culled to make room for the strong." Crystal Song let out a sound like shattering ice and collapsed to the floor. Her skin went completely dark as her consciousness fled, and dangerous-looking cracks spread across her body. Jake realized with horror that she was dying, her species equivalent of a heart attack brought on by extreme stress. Zexathar looked down at the convulsing Zenthari with satisfaction. "Fascinating," he said. "I wonder what would happen if I applied a little more pressure to the others." That was the moment Jake snapped. Every wall he had built around his instincts crumbled in an instant. Every lesson about restraint and cooperation and peaceful coexistence vanished from his mind. All that remained was the cold, calculating fury of a persistent predator whose pack was under attack. Jake stepped into the corridor. Zexthar. His voice was different now. Gone was the careful, controlled tone he had used for months at the academy. This was the voice of something that had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain through millions of years of violence and survival. The Valdorian turned toward him, and for the first time since Jake had known him, Zexthar looked genuinely surprised. Whatever he saw in Jake's face made him take an involuntary step backward. "The human," Zexthar said, but his usual confident tone was missing. "Come to rescue your fellow students? How predictably heroic." Jake did not respond immediately. He was studying Zexathar the way his ancestors had studied wounded predators on the African savanna, calculating weaknesses, measuring distances, planning the hunt. "Move away from them," Jake said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly in the confined space of the corridor. "Or what?" Zexthar demanded, but Jake could smell the first traces of uncertainty in his scent. "You will fight me? Here? In front of witnesses?" Jake smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "No," he said softly. "I am going to teach you the difference between a Class 4 predator and a Class 7 survivor." Behind Zexthar, Spiral Bright was frantically trying to help Crystal Song, while Whispersoft called for medical assistance on her communicator. But Jake's attention was completely focused on the Valdorian blocking their path. For the first time in his life, Zexthar was face to face with something more dangerous than himself. And Jake could see in those yellow eyes that some primitive part of the Valdorian's brain was finally beginning to understand what that meant. Jake stepped further into the corridor, and something fundamental changed in the air. The students pressed against the wall felt it immediately. A shift in the balance of power that made their primitive survival instincts suddenly pay attention to the human instead of the Valdorian. For months, Jake had carefully hidden his true nature. He had walked softly, spoken quietly, and made himself seem as harmless as possible. But now, for the first time since arriving at the academy, he let the mask drop completely. His posture straightened, not to his full height, but to something more dangerous. The balanced stance of a predator ready to move in any direction. His breathing slowed and deepened, the way distance runners breathed when settling in for a long chase. His eyes fixed on Zexathar with the absolute focus of something that had never lost a hunt. Zexathar felt the change immediately. The Valdorian's head tilted slightly, the way predators did when they suddenly detected a threat they had not seen before. His confident smile faltered. "Move," Jake said again. The word was spoken so quietly that it was barely audible, but it seemed to echo in the corridor like a gunshot. "I do not take orders from prey species," Zexthar replied. But there was something forced about his bravado now. He was trying to maintain his dominance through words, but his body language was already starting to betray him. Jake took another step forward. "You think I am prey?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zexthar's yellow eyes darted between Jake's face and his hands, trying to assess the threat level. What he saw there made his scales ripple with the first signs of stress. "You are human," Zexthar said, but now it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "Deathworlders, yes, but still just another species of clever prey. Your people use tools and technology because you are too weak to survive with just your bodies." Jake's smile widened, and Zexthar unconsciously took a step backward. It was the first time since entering the academy that anyone had seen the Valdorian retreat from anything. "You want to know about humans?" Jake asked. His voice was still, soft, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now that made even Spiral Bright stop trying to help Crystal Song and stare. "Let me tell you what we really are." Jake began walking forward slowly, and Zexthar found himself backing, a way to maintain distance. The Valdorian's predatory instincts were screaming warnings that his conscious mind was struggling to understand. "We are persistence predators," Jake explained calmly. "Do you know what that means, Zexthar? It means we do not hunt by being the fastest or the strongest. We hunt by never giving up." Another step forward. Another step back from Zexthar. "Our ancestors would pick a target, something bigger and stronger than themselves. A mammoth, maybe, or a buffalo. Then they would follow it, not for minutes or hours, but for days, weeks if necessary." Jake's eyes never left Zexthar's face as he spoke. The Valdorian was still trying to look fierce, but his pupils were dilating with stress. The prey would run, of course. It would use its speed and strength to escape. But humans never stopped following. We would track it across mountains, through rivers, across endless plains. We would follow it until its heart burst from exhaustion. Zexthar's breathing was becoming more rapid. Some primitive part of his brain was recognizing the truth in Jake's words, recognizing a type of predator that his species had never encountered. "But that is not the worst part," Jake continued, still advancing slowly. "The worst part is that we are pack hunters. When one human gets tired, another takes over the chase. When we run out of spears, we make more. When we get injured, the pack keeps hunting while we heal." The corridor was not very long, and Zexthar was running out of room to back up. His shoulders hit the wall behind him, and Jake saw panic flicker in his yellow eyes. "We do not just kill our prey, Zexthar. We terrify it first. We let it know it is being hunted. We let it run until it is exhausted and desperate and hopeless. Then, when it finally collapses from fear and fatigue, we move in for the kill." Jake stopped advancing, when he was just 2 arm lengths away from the Valdorian. At this distance, Zexthar could see every detail of the human's face, and what he saw there made his scales begin to shift color with stress. "And here is the thing that your warrior culture never taught you," Jake said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "We did not evolve on some Class 4 world where the biggest predator wins. We evolved on a Class 7 death world where everything was trying to kill us. The weather, the diseases, the other predators, even the plants." Zexthar was pressed fully against the wall now, his massive frame somehow looking small and vulnerable. "We survived by being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than anything else on our planet. We turned cooperation into a weapon. We turned persistence into an art form. We turned fear itself into a tool for hunting." Jake leaned slightly closer, and Zexthar flinched away from him. "So when you threaten members of my pack," Jake continued, "when you hurt someone under my protection, you are not dealing with some simple prey species. You are dealing with the most successful predator in the known galaxy." The silence that followed was broken only by Crystal Song's labored breathing as Spiral Bright tried to keep her stable. Zexthar stood frozen against the wall, his predatory confidence completely shattered. For the first time in his life, the Valdorian warrior understood what it felt like to be prey. "Now," Jake said in that same quiet, terrible voice, "move away from my friends. And if you ever threaten any of them again, I will show you exactly what 8 million years of persistence hunting looks like." Zexithar's nerve finally broke. He scrambled sideways along the wall, desperate to put distance between himself and the human. His movement was clumsy and panicked, nothing like the graceful predator who had entered the academy just days before. Jake turned his attention to the injured students, and his demeanor immediately shifted back to concern and care. But Zexithar could not stop staring at him, finally understanding that he had been sharing a classroom with something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The medical team arrived within minutes of Whisper Soft's emergency call. Jake stepped back to give them room to work on Crystal Song, but he kept himself positioned between the medical staff and Zexthar. The Valdorian had not moved from where. He had pressed himself against the wall, his yellow eyes fixed on Jake with a mixture of fear and confusion. As the medics carefully loaded Crystal Song onto a transport gurney, her crystalline body showed dangerous stress fractures that would take weeks to heal. The sight of her injuries reignited the cold anger in Jake's chest. "Will she be okay?" Spiral Bright asked anxiously, his elongated form coiled with worry. "She will recover," the lead medic, a gentle Veltani, assured him. "But this level of stress damage suggests severe psychological trauma. What happened here?" Before anyone could answer, Jake turned to face Zexthar fully. The Valdorian was still frozen against the wall, his predatory confidence replaced by something Jake had never seen in him before: genuine fear. "You wanted to know about predators," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the corridor. "Let me finish the lesson." The medics paused in their work, sensing the tension in the air. Spiral Bright and Whisper Soft watched with wide eyes as Jake continued his explanation. "You think being from a Class 4 world makes you special," Jake said to Zexthar. "You think having claws and teeth and strength makes you a true predator. But you understand nothing about real survival." Jake began pacing slowly, his movements controlled but predatory. Zexithar's eyes tracked his movement like a cornered animal watching a circling hunter. "Earth is not just dangerous because of its predators," Jake explained. "It is dangerous because of everything. Our weather systems can kill thousands in a single storm. Our diseases mutate so fast that our immune systems wage constant war just to keep us alive. Our own planet tries to murder us with volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, and ice ages." The medical team had finished loading Crystal Song, but they lingered to listen. Even they seemed fascinated by this glimpse into what made Deathworlders different. "But here is what you really do not understand, Zexthar," Jake continued. "Humans did not survive Earth by being the strongest or the fastest. We survived by being the most adaptable killers in the history of evolution." Jake stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on the Valdorian. "We learned to hunt in packs because individual strength was not enough. We learned to make tools because our claws and teeth were not enough. We learned to plan and coordinate because simple aggression was not enough." Zexthar's breathing was rapid and shallow. His scales had shifted to patterns that Jake's research told him indicated extreme stress in Valdorian physiology. "Your species hunts for sport and dominance," Jake said. "You enjoy the fear of your prey because it makes you feel powerful. But human ancestors hunted for survival." We did not hunt because we enjoyed it. We hunted because the alternative was extinction. Jake's voice grew quieter, more intense. Do you know what persistence hunting really means? It means following wounded prey for so long that it dies from exhaustion and terror. It means coordinating with other hunters across vast distances. It means tracking a single animal for days while it grows more and more desperate to escape. The corridor was completely silent except for Jake's voice and Zexthar's labored breathing. We would injure the prey just enough to slow it down. Jake continued. Then we would follow it while it bled and weakened. We would take turns chasing it so that it could never rest. We would herd it away from water and food. We would make sounds in the darkness to keep it from sleeping. Zexthar made a small sound in his throat, something between a whimper and a growl. The prey would run until its muscles failed. It would hide until we found it again. It would fight until it had no strength left. And through it all, we would be there, patient, relentless, inevitable. Jake took a step closer to Zexthar, who pressed himself even further against the wall. That is what 8 million years of evolution on a Class 7 Deathworld creates, Jake said softly. Not just predators, not just hunters, but something that turns the act of killing into a science. The Valdorian was visibly shaking now, his warriors' pride completely broken by the realization of what he had been trying to intimidate. But here is the most important thing, Jake continued, his voice becoming almost gentle. Humans learned that the deadliest thing in the universe is not a single predator. It is a pack of predators who care about each other. Jake gestured toward Spiral Bright and Whisper Soft, who were still watching the confrontation with amazement. You thought these students were prey because they are small and gentle and afraid of violence. But you were wrong. They are not prey. They are my pack. And when you threaten my pack, you wake up something that your species never had to face. Jake's eyes never left Zexthar's as he delivered his final words. You are a predator from a Class 4 world where strength rules. But I am a persistence hunter from a Class 7 death world where only the most ruthless survive. And the difference between us is that I do not hunt for pleasure or dominance. Jake smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Zexthar had ever seen. I hunt to protect my pack, and when someone threatens them, I do not stop hunting until the threat is eliminated, not tired, not defeated, eliminated. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Zexthar finally understood that he was not dealing with another predator competing for dominance. He was dealing with something that viewed him as a threat to be removed from existence. For the first time in his life, the Valdorian warrior knew what it felt like to be hunted by something smarter, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous than himself. The days following the confrontation in the maintenance corridor brought a dramatic change to life at the academy. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the student body, though the details grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some said the human had physically defeated the Valdorian in combat. Others claimed he had used some kind of mental powers to break Zexthar's will. Jake ignored the rumors and focused on what mattered, helping his friends recover from their ordeal. Crystal Song spent 3 days in the medical bay while her crystalline body slowly healed from the stress fractures. Jake visited her every day, bringing her favorite foods from the cafeteria and helping her catch up on missed assignments. She was still nervous around loud noises and sudden movements, but the warm, caring presence of her friends helped speed her recovery. Spiral Bright and Whisper Soft both suffered from what human psychologists would call mild trauma, but they were resilient. With support from Jake and the other students, they gradually returned to their normal routines. The most dramatic change, however, was in Zexthar himself. The Valdorian warrior who had strutted into the academy with such confidence was gone, replaced by someone who moved quietly through the halls and spoke only when spoken to. He no longer took food from other students' trays. He no longer made threatening comments in class. He no longer used his size and presence to intimidate anyone. At first, the other students were simply relieved. The atmosphere in their classes returned to the peaceful, cooperative environment they were used to. Students who had stopped attending began to return. Conversations that had been whispered in fear were now spoken aloud with confidence. But as the days passed, Jake began to notice something else. Zexthar was not just subdued, he was broken. The Valdorian sat alone in the cafeteria, ate mechanically without tasting his food, and stared at nothing during lectures. He looked like someone whose entire worldview had been shattered. Jake found himself thinking about this problem more and more. He had wanted to stop Zexthar from hurting people, and he had succeeded. But turning a proud warrior into a frightened shadow was not the victory he had hoped for. On the 7th day after the confrontation, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down across from Zexthar in the cafeteria. Valdorian looked up from his untouched meal with startled yellow eyes. Around them, conversations stopped as other students noticed what was happening. The human who had faced down the Academy's most feared predator was voluntarily sitting with him. "Hello, Zexthar," Jake said calmly. The Valdorian's response was barely audible. "Human." They sat in silence for several minutes. Jake ate his lunch normally while Zexthar continued to stare at his food. Finally, Jake spoke again. "You know, my people have a saying," he said conversationally. "The strongest predators do not need to prove their strength to anyone." Zexthar's eyes flicked up to meet his, then quickly looked away. "On Earth," Jake continued, "the most dangerous animals are often the ones that look harmless. A house cat is a more efficient killer than a lion, pound for pound. But the cat does not roar to announce its presence." Jake took another bite of his food and watched Zexthar's reaction. The Valdorian was listening, though he was trying to pretend otherwise. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that your people sent you here to learn something important. Not about other species being weak, but about strength that does not need to prove itself." For the first time in a week, Zexthar spoke without being asked a direct question. "My instructors told me that other species would respect Valdorian strength," he said, quietly. "They said showing dominance would earn me a place in the hierarchy." Jake nodded. "Your instructors were not wrong about hierarchies, but they misunderstood what creates real respect." He gestured around the cafeteria, where students were now talking and laughing freely. "These people do not fear me anymore, even though they know what I am capable of." "Do you know why?" Zexthar shook his head slightly. "Because I only use my strength to protect them, never to threaten them," Jake explained. "Real predators do not hunt their own pack." Something shifted in Zexthar's expression. For the first time since their confrontation, he looked directly at Jake without flinching. "I do not understand your species," Zexthar admitted. "You could dominate everyone here easily. You could take whatever you wanted. Why do you choose to be gentle?" Jake smiled, and this time it was not threatening. "Because true strength is knowing when not to use your power. Any fool can break things. It takes wisdom to build them." Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Zexthar began to change again, but in a different direction. Instead of the broken shadow he had become, he started to rebuild himself along different lines. He began helping smaller students carry heavy equipment, using his strength to assist rather than intimidate. He started asking questions in class, instead of making threatening pronouncements. He even began eating lunch with some of the other students, though he was careful to keep his voice low and his movements slow. Crystal Song was the first to forgive him. Jake was not surprised. Her species valued healing and growth above holding grudges. She approached Zexthar one day in the library and quietly thanked him for helping her reach a book on a high shelf. "I am sorry," Zexthar said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "For what I did to you, for what I nearly caused." Crystal Song's skin sparkled with gentle patterns that indicated compassion. "We all make mistakes when we are afraid," she said softly. "You were afraid too, in your own way." Jake watched this interaction from across the library and felt something he had not expected: pride. Not in his own actions, but in seeing both Crystal Song and Zexthar choose growth over revenge. By the end of the semester, the academy had returned to its peaceful atmosphere. But it was a different kind of peace than before, stronger, more mature. The students had learned that true safety did not come from avoiding all conflict, but from having protectors who were strong enough to handle threats and wise enough to know when protection was needed. Zexthar never became close friends with most of his classmates, but he earned their respect through consistent acts of kindness and restraint. He learned to channel his predatory instincts into protective ones, becoming someone the smaller students could turn to when they needed help. And Jake finally found the balance he had been searching for since arriving at the academy. He no longer had to hide what he was, but he also did not have to be defined by it. He was a human from a death world, yes, but he was also a friend, a protector, and a bridge between different ways of understanding strength. On the last day of classes, Professor Veltar pulled Jake aside after the final xenobiology exam. "I wanted to thank you," the old Xanthari said, his crystalline skin glowing with warm patterns. "What you did, it could have gone very wrong, but instead you turned a crisis into a learning experience for everyone." Jake shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done." "That," Professor Veltar said with a smile, "is exactly what makes you a true apex predator. Not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary and when creation is possible." As Jake left the classroom for the last time, he passed Zexthar, helping Pip carry her study materials to the dormitory. The small Cathani was chattering happily about her exam scores, while the massive Valdorian listened with patient attention. It was not the ending Jake had expected when he first sat in the back corner of that classroom months ago, but it was better than anything he could have planned. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important lessons were not about showing strength, but about choosing when to use it.